Marty, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born and raised, and maybe some of your family background and upbringing?
Well, I was born in the Bronx, New York, which I always like to remind people is the only part of the city of New York that's truly part of the United States. The rest of it's an offshore island. And I was born in August 7th of 1941, and grew up in basically a tenement neighborhood in the Bronx with my sister, and shared a room with my sister until I was thrown out and told to go get my own place to live. Just basically a street kid that hung out.
You went to school in the Bronx as well, high school?
High school, William Howard Taft High School. Probably the most notorious thing about William Howard Taft High School is that Leon Trotsky, during the time he lived in the Bronx, lived directly across the street from there, and then went to Mexico and was shot.
How did you become interested in reporting?
It's interesting. I was a hopeless student at that time at Long Island University, and I really was going nowhere. My great aunt suggested that I talk to a cousin of mine, my cousin Julius Gherkin, his name was, or Gorkin, and he was a Supreme Court reporter in New York State, in Long Island, and talked to him about court reporting. So I said, sure, and I talked to Julius, and he introduced me to, oddly enough, they don't remember it, I'm sure, Bill and Arnold Cohen, who were then, of course, the great speed champions and great reporters, who he worked with and whom he worked with. And that was my introduction to court reporting.
And what school did you go to?
I started at Stenotype Institute of New York City. It was on Madison Avenue, and stayed there for quite a while, and then transferred to Merchants and Bankers Business and Secretarial School, and long gone, where many of the great reporters of the era on the East Coast attended. And never graduated from court reporting school, but then again, back then, nobody ever did.
What was the thing you remember most about your reporting school career?
I have a number of memories, some of them very, like everyone, the usual struggling, and no amount of practicing was enough. You practiced and practiced. I think the thing that I remember most was, once a day, at some point during the day, our instructor, Jesse Benton, would go ahead and would say, okay, we're going to do a 300-minute, a word a minute, Q&A. And he was an incredible dictator. He was able to dictate 4 voices, and none of them sounded alike. I mean, this guy was incredible. And Jesse got up there, and every day at that time, or whatever it was, he would truly dictate 300 words a minute for 15 seconds. And after everybody wrote, you would suddenly hear about 15, 20 seconds after he got done, somebody would shout, I got it, I got it. And that was the guy that got the read back. Whoever got it first.
What was your first reporting job?
My first reporting job was with the City of New York in the Office of the Controller, the Bureau of Law and Adjustment. And it was I reported these ex parte hearings where a master or an examiner would conduct in-depth hearings into sewer main breaks and water main breaks, sewer breaks. And people would come in and file claims to the city, with the city, and that's what my first job was.
Can you give us a short synopsis of how your career evolved thereafter?
Well, I was working there for a while, and I realized that there was only so much one can do with water main breaks. So I decided that I wanted to become a freelance reporter, and I looked around for a position and found one in a firm that was on Lower Manhattan in the Nassau Street. It was an old office building. If you took your shoes and socks off and walked on the floor, you would get splinters in this building. I mean, it was so old. I went to work there, and it was there that I actually, I met a good friend, Bernie Goldstein, and we worked together for a number of years, Bernie and I there. The principal of the firm always had a habit of firing his senior person. Bernie became the senior person, and we knew he was going to be canned. And I said, what are you going to do? He says, I'm going to take a position in Philadelphia. And so he left, and he went down to Philly, called me up. I told him, give me a call if anything breaks down there. And it was kind of difficult to get into the courts in New York at the time. So he called me up and said, there's a position in Philly as an assistant official, the same job he had. So I left New York, I guess that was in 1963. And I went to Philadelphia, went to work as an assistant to a fellow named Joe Newhouse, who was an official reporter in Common Pleas Court number 5. At that time, whenever they created a new Common Pleas Court of 3 judges, they would give it a new number. Harry Forster was in Common Pleas Court number 6. And a number of great reporters there. Vince Varallo, who is the current uncle, was the uncle and of Ed Varallo, and the father of Vince Varallo Jr., both long-term members, as we know, of this group, was also with Harry in number 6. So in any event, I went to work as an assistant in number 5 court, taking depositions under the official reporter because they took depositions, master's hearings for divorces, and also working in the courts. And did that for a while. I wound up, unfortunately, something was going on in Southeast Asia that became a bit of a distraction for me. But when I returned from the military, I was only in for a short while, I went to work I was appointed to a position in a newly created Common Pleas Court. It was Common Pleas Court number 9. And each reporter worked for their own judge. I worked for Judge James T. McDermott, who was one of the great men that I knew in my life, maybe the greatest. And worked for him for 16.5 years in the courthouse.
And at some point then you started your own freelance firm thereafter. And
well, eventually what happened after that was I was working in the Common Pleas Court, and in the early 70s we began to hear rumblings about CAT, computer-aided transcription. And there was only one CAT company at that point that really had a working system called Stenocomp, well, kind of working system. And they had put that system into Frank Nelson's office in L.A. at the time. He wasn't in Santa Barbara. And also into Dick Tuttle's office up in
Reno?
In Reno. I believe that's where it was, yeah. I think it was Tuttle's. And they had these systems, and they were trying to make them work. It was very difficult for them because they had to telecommunicate everything from that mini-computer, the Data General mini-computer, at about 300 baud back to Washington, D.C. to a service center. And it was just a nightmare to get the stuff to telecommunicate right. We received a grant in the Common Pleas Court, and it was during the Nixon administration, from the through the Law Enforcement and Assistance Administration and the Governor's Justice Council, to put a system in. And we put the first courthouse CAT system ever into place there. And our advantage was that we had a little thing called the mainframe computer, an IBM 360 that filled this huge room. And we were able to avoid the perils that Frank and Dick and people like that went through of having to telecommunicate. We would take the data by physically carrying it into this service center, and then they would translate it there. And so I did one of the first 3, Bernie Goldstein, who I knew, who brought me to Philadelphia, and a fellow named Len Katz, who was a freelance, eventually owned a freelance firm in Philly, and myself went on the system as the first 3 officials. And I had the distinction of doing the first criminal jury trial ever done on a CAT system. And it worked. We had a good system. It did work because we had that one link that we were able to solidify. And we became, I guess, essentially the first standalone CAT system in a sort of strange way. And we kept that going until around 1981, from the early 70s. A lot of the court was on that system.